I remember the early days when I first noticed something shifting inside me. Back then, I was still the person everyone counted on, motivated, reliable, the one who seemed to handle whatever came my way. There was a sense of fire, even when the days stretched long and the weight of obligations pressed down. But somewhere along the way, things began to change in ways I couldn't pinpoint at first. It wasn't sudden. It was subtle, like the slow dimming of a light you didn't realize had started flickering. It started with moments of exhaustion that didn't make sense. I'd wake up after a full night's sleep and feel drained, as though I'd run a marathon in my dreams. My body wasn't aching. There was no physical reason I could find for such deep tiredness. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just a phase, a little bump in the road. But then came the evenings when even my favorite music barely lifted my spirits, when conversations felt heavy and smiles seemed forced. It was as if my energy had been siphoned without my knowing, leaving behind a hollow space I couldn't fill. The frustration crept in quietly, like a low hum beneath the surface of my thoughts. I found myself snapping over little things, inconsequential moments that, in the past, would have rolled right off me. My patience thinned, and those closest to me started noticing. "Are you okay?" they asked, but I wasn't sure how to answer. Because honestly, I didn't understand what was happening inside. It was more than just stress or tiredness. There was a creeping numbness, a loss of joy in the things that used to light me up. I could see a shadow stretching slowly over my days, but I wasn't sure how deep it went. One evening, I sat across from a close friend who looked at me with concern. "You don't seem like yourself," she said softly. Her words hit harder than I expected. I felt like someone observing my life from the outside, bewildered by the gaps I couldn't explain. I wanted to tell her the truth, that beneath the surface, anxiety was no longer that familiar buzzing presence I could push aside. It had morphed into something heavier, something draining the very energy I needed to keep going. I started to recognize that what I thought was just being tired was something different altogether. It was exhaustion that came not from physical exertion, but from the constant tension inside my mind and body. It wasn't just about feeling weary. It was about feeling worn down, as if every worry and fear had slowly chipped away at the foundation of who I was. And there it was, the profound emptiness that followed. Not an emptiness I could cure with distraction or brief moments of rest. It was a quiet void that swallowed enthusiasm and left a lingering ache, the kind you don't openly talk about, because you worry people won't understand. I could see it in my reflection, eyes that looked a little less certain, a posture that had somehow shrunk over time. Looking back, I realized I was the hero of my own story, stubborn and determined. I tried to keep going, to mask the cracks with a smile and a facade of functionality. But the truth was, the anxiety I once thought I could control was evolving. It wasn't disappearing when ignored. It was transforming into something I had never prepared myself to face. I didn't want to admit it at first. Part of me resisted acknowledging this growing inner battle. Maybe you know that feeling, the tension between wanting to be strong and fearing what it really means to confront the truth of your own vulnerability. But denying what was happening only made the path darker. This isn't just my story. I see it everywhere. The quiet struggle under the surface of people juggling endless demands, the invisible weight carried behind tired eyes. Many of us start so full of purpose, resistant to the idea that we could ever be overtaken by something as intangible as anxiety turning into exhaustion. We tell ourselves to just push harder, to ignore the signs, to keep going because this is who I am. But here's what I've come to understand. When that fatigue seeps deep enough, when the irritation becomes constant and the pleasures of life fade into the background, it's a signal, not a sign of weakness, but a cry for attention from a part of us that needs more than just another to-do checklist or empty promises to relax. The moment I realized I needed to pay attention was the moment everything began to shift. It was scary, but it was necessary. Because if left unattended, this silent transformation, the evolution of anxiety into emotional burnout, can erode more than just our energy. It can cloud our joy and dim the light of who we truly are. And so, this is where the journey begins. Not with easy answers or quick fixes, but with the raw acknowledgement of what's really happening. Together, we will delve into the signs that too often go unnoticed, the subtle messages our minds and bodies send when they're stretched beyond their limits. We'll uncover what's behind the exhaustion that isn't just tiredness, the irritability that feels like an avalanche, the loss of interest that haunts even the brightest moments. This is a call, not to fear, but to awareness, not to surrender, but to protection. Because recognizing these signs early is our strongest defense. It's about learning to listen, not just to the loud demands of the world, but to the quiet truths within ourselves. In the next steps, I'll walk alongside you through this landscape, sharing what I've learned, what I'm still learning, and how we can pause the cycle before it tightens its grip. For now, sit with this truth. The struggle you're feeling is real, the weariness is valid, and you are not alone. There is a path forward, even when the shadows feel most all-encompassing. Let's begin this journey, because somewhere beneath this exhaustion, a stronger, wiser self is waiting to be found. My days began to blur into a monotonous hum, each moment indistinguishable from the next. It was as if I was moving through molasses, weighed down by an invisible force that sapped my vitality before I even had a chance to begin. I recall a particular afternoon when I sat at my desk, staring blankly at the screen, heart pounding without reason. Around me, the world buzzed with activity, but I felt detached, crippled by a restlessness that seemed to clash with an unyielding fatigue deep within. I could sense a storm brewing inside, a tumult of emotions tangled with an undeniable weariness that no amount of coffee or distraction could outrun. This creeping fatigue wasn't the kind you shake off by sleeping in on weekends or stealing a moment in the sun. It felt more like my nervous system had been stretched to a snapping point, vibrating with an invisible tension that made even simple decisions feel insurmountable. I felt like a radio desperately searching for a clear signal, but only picking up static filled with interference. The usual spark, that subtle excitement driving me forward, was flickering and unreliable. I realized I was tangled in a silent battle, fighting against a depletion that always seemed one step ahead, eroding my capacity to engage fully with life. One evening, I tried to explain to my partner how I was feeling, struggling to string together words that would capture the heaviness inside me. It's like, imagine carrying an invisible backpack, I said, gesturing loosely. But every day, someone slips another stone inside, and I don't even notice until my shoulders ache too much to stand tall. Their eyes filled with concern, but I could see they didn't quite grasp the depth of my draining reserve. That moment marked a turning point, a fragile admission that something was slipping beyond my control. As nights stretched longer, I noticed my mind shifting in strange ways. Thoughts once clear became cluttered, like pages of a journal half erased by rain. I caught myself zoning out in conversations, losing track of ideas mid-sentence. The constant noise behind my eyes made it hard to focus, tugging at the edges of my patience and tolerance. Even small setbacks triggered disproportionate waves of irritation. I remember snapping at a friend over a trivial misunderstanding, something I'd normally laugh off, but instead, I felt an unshakable current of frustration undercut me. It was exhausting trying to explain or justify these moments because, internally, I was fighting against the erosion of my emotional thresholds. Another chapter in this silent unraveling was the gradual disappearance of joy. Activities that once sparked life into my veins, the laughter of friends, the rhythm of a favorite song, the simple thrill of a walk in the park, now seemed muted, distant, like watching a vibrant movie through a fogged window. I tried to coax enjoyment from these things, but the effort required left me even more depleted. At one point, I found myself staring out at a glowing sunset, a scene that should have swept me into awe, yet all I felt was a complicated blend of numbness and longing. It was as if an internal reservoir meant for delight had run dry. In these moments, I realized the emotional armor I'd built around myself began to crack. Whereas before I might have confronted stress with fierce determination, now my energy reserves no longer permitted defiance. Instead, I found myself retreating, hesitant to engage deeply, fearful that the fragile balance of my limited reserves would tip toward collapse. Conversations became scripted performances, smiles felt rehearsed, and social gatherings transformed into draining obligations. The internal dialogue shifted from confidence to doubt, from hope to a quiet sense of despair. But amid this unraveling, one thing grew sharper: my awareness of warning signs I had once missed or ignored. For example, a recurring restlessness that turned my nights into battles against racing thoughts. My body communicated through subtle aches and tension patterns I hadn't noticed before, a tightness around my chest, a persistent knot in my stomach. The world seemed suddenly louder, more chaotic, as if my senses were on constant high alert. Yet paradoxically, I felt detached from my own emotional responses. This foreign sensation unsettled me deeply, challenging the sense of control I desperately clung to. In the quiet hours, I began asking myself what this meant, not just intellectually, but with the weight of feeling saturating each question. Could I continue to function effectively under this constant strain? Was the cost to my sense of self worth the facade of productivity and normalcy? The answers weren't clear, but the growing urgency to address this decline became impossible to ignore. A faint but steady spark ignited inside me, urging a different approach, a turning away from denial toward a willingness to explore, understand, and amend what I had until then suppressed. Now, consider how this applies when you face moments where your spirit feels drained and your reactions sharpened beyond reason. When a simple conversation feels exhausting or the idea of engaging in hobbies seems like an uphill climb, it's not just moodiness or lack of willpower. It's a signal your system is struggling to balance internal pressures while maintaining outward function. Recognizing this state requires honest self-inquiry, the courage to observe without judgment how often irritability creeps in, how little energy remains to enjoy the good parts of your day, and how motivation dwindles into a reluctant obligation. By becoming fluent in your internal signals, you develop a nuanced awareness that can interrupt or down before it becomes overwhelming. Like tuning an instrument that's gone out of harmony, this sensitivity grants the ability to recalibrate before tension fractures your well-being. It's not a quick fix, but a disciplined practice of noticing and responding with care, cultivating space for restoration amid life's demands. I remember I began this by jotting down patterns, the irritations, the empty moments, the physical sensations, to see whether they followed a rhythm or cluster around specific triggers. That simple act of documenting shifted my perspective. It transformed a nameless malaise into a tangible map, a guide turning confusion into informed action. This process awakened a seed of hope, rooted in the possibility that exhaustion and irritability need not define our existence. Instead, they can become doorways revealing where support is needed, both from within ourselves and from others. It's a delicate dance between recognizing limits and rediscovering dormant reservoirs of resilience, often buried beneath the very fatigue we resist acknowledging. If this resonates with the weariness you carry, know that these explorations are vital steps in reclaiming your energy and joy. By embracing the complexity of what's unfolding inside, you create the groundwork for healing that honors your humanity in all its imperfect, beautiful reality. I can't recall exactly when the sharp edge of irritability slipped into every corner of my day, but I do remember a moment at the supermarket when it hit me in full force. As the cashier struggled to scan my groceries, every beep seemed to echo louder not because of the noise itself, but because my patience thinned until it snapped like a rusted wire. I caught myself snapping back sharply, my voice harsher than intended, and immediately felt a pang of guilt. These instances piled up over time, little volcanic eruptions of frustration erupting faster and leaving a burnt-out trail behind. It wasn't simply stress boiling over. It was my emotional fuel running dangerously low, boiling dry. One afternoon, while sitting in coffee shop silence, I realized that even my thoughts were jumbled and slippery, darting from one worry to another, bouncing against an invisible wall, never settling. This restless mental chatter wasn't the usual kind of stress-induced noise. It resembled more like static, endless, buzzing, insistent but meaningless. I imagined it as a swarm of gnats buzzing relentlessly around my head, distracting and draining me simultaneously. This persistent mental fog made organizing simple tasks feel like climbing a steep hill wearing heavy boots. It was disorienting, eroding my confidence quietly but steadily. At times, the hollow feeling inside stretched so wide that I could almost hear it echo. Joy seemed to have packed its bags and left town without me. Once, during a weekend getaway to a place I'd loved visiting, I wandered along the shoreline under a golden sunset. I expected the familiar surge of peace and awe, but the colors felt muted, and the breeze had lost its crispness. My heart was present, yet numb, like an old radio playing songs I used to love but now faded into indistinct hums, devoid of connection. It was a profound loneliness, not because I was disconnected from others, but because I couldn't quite reconnect with myself. Early one morning, I sat by the window, watching the first light stroke the rooftops, and allowed myself a rare moment of honesty. I asked aloud, "What am I missing?" It struck me then that the vitality I once drew upon was being siphoned off in small, often invisible siphons. Constant worry, restless unease, and underlying tension that had become a background hum in my life. My nervous system, I realized with a jolt, wasn't designed to stay in this heightened state indefinitely. It was as if my internal wiring was fraying, and no patch seemed to hold long enough to restore balance. Another layer I hadn't paid attention to before was the shifting relationship I had with simple pleasure. Food, music, laughter, things that once felt like rewards or little celebrations, now required effort to engage with. I remember attempting to play the piano in my living room. My fingers hovered tentatively above the keys, but the melodies felt foreign, lacking the warmth and comfort they used to bring. Instead of relaxation, frustration brewed, and I closed the lid, feeling a pang of defeat. The emotional connection had dulled in ways I didn't initially notice, until it suddenly became glaringly obvious. I also noticed my interactions with friends changing. Conversations that once lifted me left me feeling drained, and social invitations became obligations I wanted to avoid rather than enjoy. At a dinner party, I caught myself zoning out as people shared stories and laughter. The room felt distant, as if I was watching through a frosted glass. It wasn't disinterest, exactly. More like an invisible barrier had settled inside me, muffling connection and engagement. When friends asked if I was okay, I struggled to explain this weariness that no one could see, but that I felt profoundly. Workdays blurred into endurance tests, where I mechanically ticked boxes on my to-do list without the spark of enthusiasm that once defined my efforts. Emails, meetings, and deadlines were mountains I climbed without the usual vigor. A profound sense of depletion colored my achievements. Success felt hollow when I didn't have the emotional energy to celebrate it. The internal pressure escalated each day, and I feared that someday my capacity to hold everything would simply snap. In these moments, I began to realize how much my internal rhythm had fractured. Tasks that required calm focus became riddled with distractions. I struggled to absorb new information, and ideas that once sparked excitement dulled into indifference. My inner dialogue often circled around themes of "I can't," "why bother," and "what's the point?" Phrases alien to my usual mindset. This mental reshuffling felt like a silent enemy, eroding the foundations of my identity from within, even as the outside world expected productivity and resilience. One quiet breakthrough came when I shared these experiences during a trusted heart-to-heart. Voicing the tangled feelings out loud gave them shape and weight, something neither I nor others could dismiss lightly anymore. I realized vulnerability wasn't a sign of collapse, but a bridge to understanding what was truly happening. This admission also uncovered a well of compassion for myself, a vital first step in healing and recalibrating. Now, consider how this applies when your internal engine struggles to ignite the simple pleasures or keeps combusting into bursts of irritability. It's not weakness or failure. It's a coded message from your nervous system signaling that it demands attention and care. The troubling shifts in patience, focus, and emotional availability are symptoms, not character flaws. Recognizing this invites a deepening of self-kindness and the beginning of meaningful change that honors your wholeness amid the pressures you face every day. In the quiet moments between day and night, I began to notice an unfamiliar dissonance settling deeper within me, a depletion not solely measured by how much I moved or how long I rested, but by a profound sense of inner fragmentation. My mind wasn't merely tired, it betrayed me, unraveling thoughts into a tangled web rather than the usual crisp clarity. I tried to grasp fleeting ideas, but they slipped like wisps of smoke through my fingers. Tasks that ordinarily demanded attention turned into mazes with invisible walls, leaving me bewildered and defeated. At one point, during a rare afternoon of solitude, I attempted to write down my thoughts. Each sentence I crafted seemed forceful and sterile, lacking the natural flow that used to come effortlessly. The pen hesitated, mirroring an internal resistance growing stronger by the hour. This was no ordinary writer's block. It was as though the wellspring of creativity had stalled, parched by an unseen drought within me. The vibrant colors of expression dulled to grayscale, and frustration settled in, mingling with a creeping sense of despair. One morning, while navigating the bustling streets, I felt an overwhelming urge to retreat, to vanish into a cocoon where external pressures couldn't penetrate my fragile state. The noise, the rapid pace of others' lives, their smiles seeming so easy and spontaneous, it all felt alien. I longed for escape, yet paradoxically feared isolation. This internal tug-of-war weighed heavily, as if I were torn between two opposing forces, the desire to connect and the need to protect what little energy I had left. Conversations became battlegrounds where I struggled to find footing. Words escaped me or poured out awkwardly, failing to convey the nuances of my inner turmoil. During a recent phone call with a close friend, I stumbled over my explanations, each pause thickening the distance between us. I don't know how to explain it, I confess quietly. It's like my emotions are behind a fog, unreachable. Their silence was a tender echo of the chasm I was navigating alone, and in that silence, the loneliness expanded like a shadow stretching its fingers into my chest. What surprised me most was how rapidly my tolerance for uncertainty shrank. Ambiguities that might have once felt exhilarating or mildly frustrating instead triggered spirals of anxious thoughts. I grappled with a rising tide of doubt, questioning decisions both big and small. Should I have answered that email? Did I upset a colleague with my curt response? The mind, once a reliable ally, morphed into a critic relentless in its scrutiny. Sleep became elusive as ruminations spun endlessly, draining my nights and setting a bleak tone for the days that followed. During one restless night, I found myself pacing my room, grappling with a persistent emptiness deeper than simple sadness. I visualized it as a cavernous space inside me, echoing and vast, threatening to swallow my fragments whole. This void wasn't hollow by accident. It was carved out by countless moments where I pushed past my limits, ignoring subtle alerts. My defense mechanisms, once sturdy bulwarks, had eroded, allowing this emptiness to expand unchecked. From the outside, life appeared normal, but underneath, a dissonance churned relentlessly. Another turning point came when I noticed my body itself had become a messenger of my turmoil. Physical sensations shifted, palpitations and a tightness in my chest emerged without clear triggers. My breath came shallow and uneven, making even simple tasks feel taxing. I recalled trying to climb a flight of stairs and halting midway, bewildered by the disproportionate effort it required. The disconnect between what I saw in the mirror, a person striving valiantly, and what I experienced internally puzzled and frightened me in equal measure. As the days marched on, the temptation to numb these sensations grew. I found myself reaching for distractions, endless scrolling on my phone, binge-watching shows, even overeating, all desperate attempts to escape the hollow ache within. But these efforts were like patching a leaky roof with paper, temporary and unsustainable. Each avoidance carved new trenches in my sense of identity, distancing me further from the wellspring of vitality I longed to reclaim. One afternoon, walking through a familiar city park, the scent of freshly cut grass and the chorus of birds momentarily stirred a flicker of calm in my chest. It was fleeting, but enough to remind me there was still a part of me yearning for connection, for healing. I sat on a worn bench, observing a child chasing butterflies with unabashed joy, and a quiet question settled beneath the surface. Could I learn to invite that spirit back within myself? That moment planted a seed of possibility. Instead of resisting what was happening, I began to entertain the idea that this draining phase wasn't a final sentence, but a call to realignment. I started to consider how cultivating gentle curiosity about these inner shifts might lead to renewed strength, rather than resisting or numbing them. That's when the notion blossomed. Perhaps true courage isn't about pushing harder amid depletion, but discovering ways to honor and replenish the very essence we tend to neglect when swept by relentless haste. Now, imagine encountering moments when your usual sources of joy dull inexplicably or your thoughts spiral beyond control. You might feel like you're drifting, untethered, exposed to the elements without shelter. In these spaces, tuning into your body's quiet signals, observing your shifting emotional landscape, and leaning into the discomfort with kindness can become transformative acts. These gestures invite restoration rather than fueling the slow burn toward collapse. I remember telling myself during an especially turbulent day, it's okay to pause, to ask for help, to redefine what strength means. This internal dialogue wasn't born from defeat, but from emerging wisdom. The recognition that healing grows from acknowledging our breaking points as essential markers on the path back to wholeness. And in holding that truth, even amid uncertainty and fatigue, I began to glimpse a horizon beyond mere survival. The moment my waking thoughts no longer aligned with my desires marked a turning point. Each morning, instead of anticipation, I confronted an overwhelming inertia, as if my will had been submerged beneath a thick fog. One afternoon, during an unremarkable meeting, my mind became this distant island, unreachable, while the room buzzed with the sterile chatter of agendas and deadlines. The deeper I sank into this disconnected state, the more I noticed a persistent tightness somewhere between my chest and throat, almost as though my emotions were being squeezed from the inside out. The relentless pressure shaped a silent barricade, obstructing genuine engagement with the world around me. I recall a particular Saturday, intended as a day of reprieve, but instead, it morphed into an exhausting parade of self-neglect. I attempted to follow my usual routines, yet a persistent emptiness gnawed at me. Sitting on the couch, I slipped through social media feeds, hoping for distraction, but the highlight reels of others' vibrant lives only accentuated my numbness. The frenetic colors and laughter felt foreign, as if watching a play through a translucent wall. Each scrolling gesture deepened the void, a hunger that no surface-level interaction could satisfy. In the stillness that followed, I noted how disconnect had seeped into my sense of self, carving a quiet loneliness even amid the clatter of digital noise. One evening, the walls of my apartment seemed to close in with an unbearable weight, and I decided to escape to a nearby park. The sky, painted with streaks of amber and violet, should have been inviting, but I arrived feeling too drained to appreciate its beauty. I sat on a bench, my fingers tracing patterns on the cold wood. Around me, laughter from a nearby group of children echoed, but instead of warmth, the sound heightened a simmering frustration within. I cursed myself inwardly for feeling so detached. A man approaching with a joyful dog caught my attention, prompting a faint smile. The dog's unabashed enthusiasm was a stark contrast to my heavy heart, a reminder that joy often thrives in simplicity, even when life feels unbearably complex. That night, restless in bed, my thoughts spiraled in loops, not about the future or past, but a creeping hopelessness I struggled to name. It wasn't a sudden wave, but a quiet, persistent undercurrent that haunted each breath. I whispered aloud, "How did this become my reality?" The words echoed back from the empty room, as if the silence itself was questioning me. Sleep would not come easily. I traced the contours of my anxiety and exhaustion, trying to uncover where the boundary blurred, searching desperately for a foothold. Conversations, too, transformed into minefields. I dreaded phone calls and text exchanges, fearing that my responses would sound hollow or distant. Invited to join friends' weekend plans, I made excuses without conviction, not out of disinterest, but from an energy budget that had drained to nearly nothing. A close friend, noticing my withdrawal, confided, "You seem like you're carrying something heavy." How could I explain a feeling so vast, so indistinct even to myself? I could only nod silently, regretting my inability to be fully present for someone who cared deeply. Then came moments of startling clarity. While reorganizing my cluttered workspace, my gaze lingered on piles of unfinished projects. Frustration surged. These fragments of enthusiasm and drive seemed like relics of a former self, slipping further away with every passing day. In that instant, I understood the toll of relentless tension on my mind and body. It was not just fatigue, but a reshaping of who I was becoming. The resilient spirit I banked on had begun to erode, replaced by an internal wilderness where energy and motivation were scarce commodities. I decided to reach out for guidance, a tentative step towards reclamation. Scheduling an appointment with a counselor felt daunting, as if admitting vulnerability might confirm fears of being too much or not enough. Yet, in that session, words I hadn't yet voiced took shape. Sharing the chaotic blend of irritability, disinterest, and exhaustion crystallized my experience into something manageable. The counselor's empathetic presence acted like a lighthouse cutting through the fog, illuminating a path that felt fraught but possible. As weeks passed, I recognized that healing demanded more than willpower. It required new rituals, deliberate pauses to nurture my frayed nervous system. I experimented with grounding exercises, breathing techniques that helped steady the storm roaring inside. In time, I found solace in mindful walks through nature's messiness, where the uneven terrain mirrored the unpredictability of my emotions. Each step fostered a subtle reconnection with myself, a counterweight to the ocean of overwhelm. Now, consider if you've ever noticed an unfamiliar tightness in your chest during routine interactions or a persistent reluctance to pursue hobbies that once sparked joy. These sensations might guard the threshold to emotional exhaustion, signaling a nervous system stretched thin. Rather than dismissing these signals as trivial, allowing space for them becomes an act of self-respect and preservation. The journey I embarked on revealed that embracing these subtle warnings enabled me to reclaim pockets of peace amid chaos, cultivating strength not through sheer force, but through tender attentiveness to what my mind and body revealed. It struck me one afternoon during a routine walk that my emotions seemed shackled beneath an invisible weight. The sun filtered softly through the leaves, casting playful shadows on the path, yet instead of lightness, a sense of heaviness gripped me. Every step felt laborious, as if invisible chains slowed my movement, not physically, but emotionally. An unexpected wave of disinterest washed over me, rendering the vibrant world colorless. It was unsettling, realizing that this was not a fleeting mood, but a deeper shift lurking beneath my usual engagement with life. Weeks passed, and these feelings didn't dissipate. Instead, I began noticing how my body was betraying subtle signals I hadn't paid adequate attention to before. My chest tightened unpredictably, like a fist squeezing my insides, tight and relentless. At times, my limbs felt numb as if they were disconnected from the rest of me. These sensations weren't accompanied by any clear triggers, which made them even more frustrating and confusing. One evening, as I lay awake, the dizziness crept in, a dizzy spiral that challenged my grasp on balance itself, both physically and mentally. One moment I distinctly recall was sitting at my kitchen table attempting to read, but the words leapt off the page, refusing to settle into meaning. The frustration mounted rapidly. Why can't I concentrate like I used to? I muttered to my reflection in the window, which offered no answers, only a reflection of my fatigue. The simple act of reading, once a sanctuary for my mind, turned into a battleground where the enemy was my scattered focus. It felt as if a veil had fallen between me and my own thoughts, blurring clarity into confusion. In parallel, I began experiencing subtle shifts in my appetite, not in the predictable stress-eating pattern, but as a hollow, unexplainable absence of hunger. Meals were consumed mechanically, lacking taste and nourishment. Even the smells and textures that usually comforted me couldn't awaken appetite. This peculiar disconnection between body and desire deepened a growing concern that my energy reserves were depleted beyond mere physical tiredness. The social world became increasingly alien. Invitations to casual gatherings sparked internal dread, not from dislike of company, but from a gnawing sensation that I was running on empty. At a small friend's birthday, I caught myself standing near a window, watching the night move past without fully participating. Conversations floated over me like distant waves, and though laughter surrounded me, I felt encapsulated in thick glass, isolated despite proximity. My smile was fragile, barely masking the internal drain that seeped into every interaction. One interaction, in particular, remains vivid. A close friend, sensing my retreat, gently asked if I was all right. Instead of the usual automatic, "I'm fine," my voice faltered, weighed down with something unspoken. "I'm not sure who I am right now," I confessed quietly. It was a raw moment, vulnerability hanging between us like fragile glass. They took my hand, their touch steady and grounding, offering a silent reminder that I did not have to weather this storm alone. That evening, wrapped in a heavy blanket, I reflected on how unfamiliar this version of myself had become. The internal exhaustion extended beyond fatigue. It was a profound disconnect, stripping life's pleasures to nearly nothing. I realized that persistent stress, gnawing silently beneath my everyday functioning, had morphed into an emotional erosion far underneath what I'd ever acknowledged consciously. Late nights became riddled with restless battles against scattered thoughts. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, watching the dark shapes morph as anxiety unfurled quietly. The mind raced with worries about functioning tomorrow, about relationships left tentative and frayed, about an undefined future that felt increasingly precarious. Sleep's refuge was only momentary, never fully covering the cracks underneath my vigilance. One morning, amid the fog of all this mental chaos, I resolved to root myself in something tangible. I started experimenting with new ways to reconnect to my body and mind. I began to draw simple sketches, chaotic lines, which surprisingly became an outlet for emotions I couldn't yet name. The act of translating inner turmoil into shapes on paper felt like breathing through my fingertips, each stroke a small reclaiming of agency. It was as if the blank page offered a mirror, reflecting a part of myself I had lost sight of amid exhaustion and anxiety. In parallel, I explored grounding exercises involving mindful movement, slow, deliberate stretches that coaxed tension from muscles and used to release. The sensations brought unexpected waves of relief, fragmenting the constant pressure that gripped me tightly. These moments, though brief, became anchors in a sea of turbulence. Gradually, I discovered a fragile rhythm between chaos and calm, a rhythm I vowed to nurture deeper. Now, consider if you notice subtle dizziness or unexplained numbness coursing through your limbs, or perhaps senses dulling to pleasures that once sparked joy. These markers often escape casual observation, but speak volumes about emotional friction beneath your surface. The quiet withdrawal from social warmth or the flood of fleeting irritability may signal more than temporary stress. Honoring these shifts with intentional curiosity helps illuminate hidden fractures before they widen. Acknowledging this altered internal terrain requires courage. Saying aloud that the struggle goes beyond mere tiredness reframes the narrative. It invites a journey not toward denial or quick fixes, but toward embracing a holistic rebalancing, physically, emotionally, and mentally. The path forward is not linear, but each step, however small, builds a scaffold of resilience atop vulnerability. In doing so, we give space for recovery that honors the complexity of our human experience. Reflecting on this journey so far, I notice how the threads of experience wind tightly around one another, each tension adding to a broader tapestry of internal unrest. It's as if I've been navigating a landscape under shifting skies, where shadows lengthen unpredictably, and the horizon blurs between exhaustion and awakening. I move through this terrain not as a passive traveler, but as someone compelled to confront the subtle erosion beneath the surface, sensing how every quiet fissure carved over time challenges the very essence of what sustains me. The path has been winding, unpredictable, its contours shaped by moments where clarity eluded me, replaced by a dense fog of uncertainty and an aching need to grasp hold of something steady. Within this unfolding story, I realize the way the subtle undercurrents have woven themselves into my daily rhythms, infiltrating spaces I'd previously thought invulnerable. The dialogue inside my mind has taken on a strange cadence, sometimes urgent, sometimes resigned, often hesitant to reveal what lies too close to the heart's fragile center. It's as if I'm both builder and witness to a structure quietly bending under pressure, a monument to resilience tested by unseen forces. The exhaustion no longer feels incidental. It has an undeniable voice, pressing me to listen, to understand its origins and implications more deeply. Yet, Simultaneously, a quiet resistance arises, a whisper urging me to uncover what remains unbroken within, even as the weight persists. I recall moments when the world seemed to hum with vibrant possibilities, only for that resonance to dim under a cloud that was impossible to dismiss. The contrast between lightness and heaviness ricochets inside with an unsettling rhythm. Those spaces where vitality once blossomed seem shrouded in stillness, as if energy itself retreats to guarded places awaiting gentle coaxing to reemerge. This paradox, that strength coexists with fragility, creates a tension I grapple with daily. How to tend to the parts aching in silence while fostering the ember of hope flickering beneath dust and fatigue. The inner terrain feels fractured yet fertile, a paradoxical ground where surrender and courage mingle. Some days, the simplest acts evoke a profound weariness that transcends the body, seeping into the marrow of my resolve. It's the sort of weariness that dulls colors, softens edges, and muffles the heartbeat of ambition. In other moments, sparks of clarity ignite, illuminating pockets of possibility I thought lost. These flashes reveal a landscape neither entirely consumed nor wholly preserved, but in flux, a dynamic interplay between depletion and renewal. The tension is palpable, like the taut string of an instrument awaiting release, both promising harmony and threatening discord. Navigating this liminal space demands attention, patience, and a willingness to relinquish illusions of control without surrendering to despair. Conversations I engage in now carry an added depth. Beneath exchanged words lies a shared acknowledgement of vulnerability, an unspoken testament to endurance and transformation. In these interactions, I glimpse reflections of my inner struggle mirrored in others' eyes, a silent fraternity bound by invisible battles. These moments of connection, fragile and profound, stitch together the frayed edges of isolation. They remind me that beneath exhaustion and irritability lies an invitation to authenticity, to meet ourselves and each other with soft curiosity rather than harsh judgment. The communal thread weaves through individual stories, weaving resilience from fragments shaped by trial and tenderness. As I continue along this unfolding journey, I'm learning how vital it is to embrace uncertainty without fear. The familiar markers of strength have shifted. What once signaled power now feels brittle, and new measures emerge from whispered lessons of acceptance and gentle persistence. There's a growing recognition that healing is not a straight line marching toward an endpoint, but a spiral, returning again and again to tender spots, each revolution offering fresh insight and deeper compassion. This cyclical process doesn't erase hardship. It redefines it, reframing challenge as an invitation into fuller presence and connection with self. In these vast internal landscapes, I sense an undercurrent of transformation stirring quietly beneath fatigue's heavy cloak, a subtle shifting that anticipates renewal yet demands patience beyond impatience's reach. The heart's whispered questions grow louder. Who am I becoming amid this dismantling? What parts of my essence remain steadfast when everything else seems fragile? These reflections linger like morning mist, fragile and shaping, offering promises not in certainty, but in the possibility held when we lean into discomfort instead of fleeing it. This unfolding awareness holds space for something tender to bloom, resilience woven through vulnerability, strength embroidered with softness. I invite you now to dwell with these ripples of experience, to feel how the recent movement inside you echoes this delicate dance of weariness and awakening. Notice the spaces where your own story intertwines with shifting energies, where exhaustion and subtle insights coalesce. Embracing these nuances reveals a threshold, a poised moment before the next step unfolds, a crossing point where the landscape shifts and deeper clarity begins to emerge from the complex mosaic of struggle and growth. It is here, in this charged stillness, that we stand on the brink of something essential. There was a quiet turning point deep within me, a gentle unraveling that stirred a question without an immediate answer. Who am I beneath all this weariness? It's as if I'd been carrying an invisible weight for so long that it had melded into the fabric of my existence, subtle and unrelenting. The slow erosion of energy wasn't some external storm to be fought off, but a whispered invitation to look inward, to discover what essential truths had been buried beneath layers of striving and resistance. I realized that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it breathes quietly in the spaces where strength feels absent. Walking through the familiar, yet suddenly foreign landscape of my inner world, I felt both fragile and fiercely alive. The contradictions that once frustrated me now seemed like intricate stitches holding together a tapestry woven with resilience and vulnerability. There was a profound recognition that healing is not a neat destination marked by visible progress, but a dynamic, ongoing dialogue with oneself, a delicate balance between compassion and accountability. The journey feels less like a battle and more like learning to dance with my shadows until they lose their sharp edges. I remember sitting on my porch one evening, the sky painted with hues of deep violet and fading gold. The world hummed softly with the crickets, a gentle rhythm that somehow calmed the tension coil inside. I thought about all the times I'd pushed myself beyond limits, refusing pauses or breaths that might have saved me from collapse. Now, I understood that honoring my limits isn't a sign of defeat, but a reclamation of agency. Each mindful breath became a small rebellion against the relentless pace demanding more than I could sustainably give. In those still moments, a new kind of strength stirred, one that whispered a promise of renewal rather than demanding relentless production or perfection. I began to see tenderness not as weakness, but as a radical act of self-preservation, a way to gather fragments of my spirit scattered across worn days. There's an immense power in embracing the brokenness without trying to smother it or pretend it isn't there. It's like finding beauty in weathered stone, realizing that cracks allow light to seep inside. I started to appreciate the art of listening, to the subtle cues in my body, to the quiet urgings of my heart, and to the wisdom incubating in my silences. This listening became a sacred space where transformation could slowly unfold, sheltered from the relentless noise outside. I was learning that interruptions to my well-being aren't merely obstacles, but invitations to deepen my relationship with myself, to rewrite the narrative that equates worthiness with relentless productivity. One afternoon, a friend said to me, "You look lighter, as if something's shifted inside." I smiled softly, realizing I carried scars shaped not into chains, but into maps guiding me through terrain once uncharted. The path had been rocky and uncertain, but each step away from denial toward awareness was a gift, a thread weaving me back into wholeness. I was being gently coaxed into becoming the author of my healing story, one marked less by endurance under pressure and more by conscious presence amid challenge. Now, I speak to anyone feeling the slow drain of invisible battles. Your experience matters profoundly, even if it feels hidden or misunderstood. There is no shame in acknowledging that your spirit needs tending, that surrendering to rest is an act of wisdom, not weakness. By embracing the complexity within, each flicker of pain, each glimmer of hope, you cultivate a fertile ground for resilience to bloom anew. The invitation is to walk with gentleness and intention, to hold your struggles as you would a fragile seed destined to grow rather than as a weight to be discarded. In the quiet embrace of self-compassion, I found a wellspring of untapped strength, a vitality born not from forcing forward, but from honoring the inherent rhythms of my being. It is here, amidst seeming fragility, that true power breathes softly, ready to rise and carry me toward a horizon shaped by possibility and grace. We are not defined by the toll of hidden battles, but by the courage to meet ourselves fully, even in our most vulnerable moments. And in that meeting lies the beginning of profound transformation, radiant enough to light a path through any darkness.